my English is very simple and my Hindi is equally simple. So, matlab, bhasha should not be a reason why we don't understand each other. With that philosophy, I will do the rest of the lecture. Okay. So, जब मुझे बुलाया गया to come and speak to you people, I was also given the brief, so the topic was decided and so on. Now this is a topic which I'm very, very interested in because I actually, those of you who are historians or even the Hindi students will know that our history has been written initially, at least in the 19th century, with a very strong Bengal focus. And although I carry the name Chakravarti, I'm not a Bengali. Okay? So I can kulla say things about Bengali. And nobody should mind because I'm not sectarian. I'm not attached to any particular region. I see myself as a product of the new India. So maybe Sara Desh is the same, and I don't see any difference between one region and another, and one bhasha and the other. But facility hoti hai, and language is a tool for us to communicate and to understand each other. So the English will be simple, and so will the Hindi be simple. The focus of historian 19th century history, and I actually came to the subject. You've already been given a small summary by Maya and your students who have described the relationship between, why our focus today is on Savitribai Phule and on Fatima Sheikh. Now, I think it's important for us to recognize how is it that Savitribai Phule is now suddenly being recognized. I mean, there is a investment in uncovering histories and also shifting the focus away from the standard way in which we told history with a particularly nationalist thrust. So national movement, usse pehle in Bengal, whatever was happening was part of the focus. Maharashtra is actually very, to me, a much more interesting space. And when I first did I'm a scholar of ancient Indian history. So strictly speaking, my training is in ancient Indian history. I worked on Buddhism for my first piece of work. And it was called Social Dimensions of Early Buddhism. And I taught myself Pali. I went to a Pali department and I studied Pali over there. I'm sorry to say that I didn't learn too much Pali. The department was simply tokenist. उसको शुरू किया था उन्होंने कि भैया 2500 साल का हम celebrate कर रहे थे of Buddhism, and it was 1956, and the Department of Pali Language and Literature was created as a kind of promotional. You know how the governments will often promote certain things. So उस वक्त promote कर रहे थे कि this is the land of the Buddha, and so they set up this thing. It was useful from the point of view of diplomacy because we were, Bandung conference. We were doing various things with Asia. So it was very important. Buddhism is important. Buddhism has always been important. आज के तहत you should actually also, those of you who are historians might be interested in the fact that the relics of the Buddha have been, they were being put on sale, and that sale was kind of stalled, but it also went through. Now we have a museum in Saket, I think, somewhere, where they've set up, Saket mein, they've set up a museum over there, and there's those jewels and all. So this is part of the promotion, the governmental policies of promoting and using history tactically whenever they want to. It's not serious because it's not as if say they will. There's a lot of politics that goes on and all of that stuff. So anyway, be that as it may, but I did when I turned to gender, when I had to start writing on thinking about gender seriously. This is the 80s. I had finished my PhD by 81, And the next piece of research I was going to do, I was quite interested by that time in trying to understand caste and gender together. I didn't want to do gender by itself because you can't hang it in the air. Gender has to actually be grounded in other conditions. So I decided that I should actually move to Maharashtra because Maharashtra had the little history of caste studies. अब जितनी इंग्लिश में बोल रही हूँ हिंदी वालों को समझ आ रही है नहीं आ रही है तो हिंदी में भी बोल सकते हैं बीच बीच में हाँ आर्यन ठीक है अच्छा पर हिंदी में भी बोल सकते हैं तो मैंने सोचा कि अच्छा अब इसको यहाँ जाकर के एक्चुअली जो ऑलरेडी रास्ता खुल गया था स्कॉलर्स ने रास्ता खोल दिया था इतिहासकारों ने लिख लिया था अच्छे लेख अवेलेबल थे उसमें गे रॉबर्ट भी थी उसमें रोजलिंडा ओहैंडन भी थी उन्होंने बहुत अच्छा काम किया था ऑन महाराष्ट्र तो उनके लिखने में they had done primary research and found material which was pioneering in some ways because caste studies took a long time to be acknowledged as an area कि हम इसको we can study it seriously or we do have material. To this day we still have less material because the archive is usually in English and it is stuck with the state के कारनामे. So it doesn't actually it's not democratic and intrinsically democratic because governments put into it what they want to put into it and at the end of the day that's only limited. Despite it, so I thought to myself, and I was also interested, and this is from those of you who are religious or in a religious institution, or there are multiple locations in which we have to now engage with religion because it's also there in the public sphere much more. It was important to try and understand. One of the things that I felt concerned about is why was religion necessary? Why was conversion at all necessary for someone who's struggling to establish the gender question? Because Pandita Ramabai, whom I was going to now try and study, she grew up in a highly, what would you call it, in a household which was a Brahmin household, but it was an interesting household because it was not invested in the normal grammatical ritualized locations. She belonged to a family of teachers or preachers. They went around. Her father was someone who had opted out in his own time when he was moving around, going from one village to another, telling stories. Harikathas, he would tell Harikatha bolte the. So he would उस तरह के and Ramabai, everyone knows that in the 19th century there was a bar on women's education. Women were not allowed to be taught in the same way. I mean, they were barred from it. And historically, our Shastras have not been particularly democratic. They have decided that women and the lower orders should not be taught. That is why it's very revolutionary to bring Savitribai Phule and Fatima Sheikh and Savitribai Phule, because the combination is quite important from the point of view of who has access to education. Why is access to education? So one of the reasons that was concerned with this case, because many of us have grown up in a secular kind of background, at least particularly in my generation, and even to some extent later, not very strongly religiously located. But so it was interesting. I was struck with this question: why did she need to convert? Why was it not enough for her just to be a feminist or an activist on her own ground without needing this? But we must also remember that actually personal faith is important to people, and it was to Ramabai. So I decided, okay, I will go and let me study Ramabai because, and through Ramabai, I will look at the entire dynamics of 19th century Maharashtra. Because 19th century Maharashtra was very different from 19th century Bengal. It had its own dynamic and it was very much more vibrant in some sense of the word. And then one discovered through these writings, because Rosalind O'Hanlon had written her book and Gail Orbit had written her book. Both of these were very important from the point of view of looking at the distinction of Mahara history in Western India, which actually became colonial, was formerly became a British, what's it called? A British administered territory fairly late, only as late as 1818. 1818 is when the British took over parts of Maharashtra, because up until that time they were stuck in Bombay, but Pune and that region was all in. So here they immediately, see, it's also caste. Those of you who acknowledge that there is caste will find it's a very small, minuscule proportion of the total population that is actually upper caste. The Bahujan is actually much, those who are not in the uppermost castes are actually the Bahujan, and the Bahujan is much larger than the aggregate of the, it's a very small proportion of people. So here is this area where 4%, literally 4% of the population gains access to English education, which the British introduced after they took over Maharashtra, and which, if you go back, you are all familiar, those of you who are historians or even हिंदी डिपार्टमेंट को know कि मैकॉले की जो मिनट थी जिसमें उन्होंने कहा कि कि हम we'll create a class of people who will be brown in color, but who will be otherwise soaked in British thinking and English education, to create a class with them very clear कि जो किसको पढ़ाना वो भी अंग्रेजी एजुकेशन किसको आप देंगे. It was not to the it was not it, and it would substitute, it was government sponsored education. It was to promote a class of people who will come out and look after the lower administrative positions, not the higher administrative positions. That would remain in the hands of the अंग्रेज हुकूमत उनके हाथ में थी और उनका शासन भी उनके हाथ में था, तो उनके वो पोजीशंस उनके गुरुओं के हाथ में रहेंगी. बट जो हम बुरे लोग हैं उनको इतनी अंग्रेजी सिखाई जाए ताकि वो हमारी क्लरिकी करें, मतलब जो रोजमर्रे का जो फाइल लिखना होता है वो सब करना होता है. सो you introduced English education, supplanting Shastric education. Now that's also important. Let's also be very clear that traditionally, since lower castes and women were excluded from the education, the number of people who would be literate or educated even in ancient times would be very, very small. You can look at the entire debates in the past and you will find that there's only one person who is described. Now we've named all these colleges. हमारे सामने Maitrey College है, और and there's Gargi College. Gargi and Maitrey are the people we took out from mythology and said, हाँ हमारे पास ऐसे औरतें थी and they were educated and whatever it is. उसमें it's a very small group of people. Gargi's own story is quite interesting because Gargi के साथ वो बहस तो करती है with Yagnyavalkya, but her the debate that she has with him, he finally ends the debate by saying, "Shut up, woman, otherwise तेरा सर फट जाएगा." So सर फटना is a theme जिससे you would shut up the arguments of the other side. And this is so at the end of the day we are saying Gargi and all, but Gargi को चुप भी करा दिया था. Then she was also good because she went back, good and slightly dicey because she goes back, she has a second round of the debate. And in that debate, she says, you are the best, you're the best brain. But the fact of the matter is that she then consents to the fact that Yagnyavalkya knows more than her, whereas actually she got him to a point where he couldn't answer a question, and he said, "Chup ho jao," which is a standard procedure. फिर तुम्हें मेरी बात काटी, fathers will say, brothers will say, "Chup ho jao." "Chup ho jao" is a statement for saying, don't ask more questions than this. Because इससे ज़्यादा तो पूछोगे, so then the whole system begins to shake a bit. So this is the dynamic. Now so you're looking at 19th century history. Let's look at 19th century history in Maharashtra with this eye. 4% population has access to these schools. Then there's a very good study of middle class, B.B. Mishra, Growth of the Middle Class. He has chapters on who takes to this English education, who are the people who go to schools. Now, it's not the Kunbis and the middle class, the agricultural class, and certainly not the lower orders. It is essentially what was already literate classes in the past, जिसमें caste on the one hand and Brahman on the other. So it's a very narrow section of people who gets access to education, to English education. Now, access to English education also means that you get writings and stuff like that, apart from the formal learning of the ABCDs and so on, people begin to, and this is well documented, they begin to read Shakespeare, they begin to read other kinds of literature, 19th century literature and so on. And one of the complaints of the 19th century men who have become literate is that their wives are all stuck in being illiterate. So, and Maharashtra had this obsession with the fact that if you studied, women would become widows. So, widowhood was supposed to be the punishment. So, how do you exclude them from the learning? Then you put conditions upon them and say that if you learn, then you'll be upsetting the system so much that whatever. This is the context. When we think of Fatima Sheikh and Savitribai Phule and so on, let's also remember कि माहौल क्या था वहाँ पर, and in what context is women's education or universal education controlled. It's the venture of the English education is highly controlled through the governmental system, and it isn't accessible to everybody. In fact, B.B. Mishra's book will show you what is the proportion of people who went to school at all. So in Maharashtra, it would be this 4% of the population, from the 4% of the population. Just also, it will be only just a few people who would actually understand that. Phule himself went to a missionary school, not to a government school. So that's also interesting. And so Phule himself is interesting because from the point of view opening himself to reading, he reads a lot of books that are published from in America, democratic material that is being published in America. They've also been through their own movements and so on. So, in fact, one of his books is Ghulamgiri is actually dedicated to the people of the United States. So you can see that the democratic agenda is very different from what the government was trying to do and what the English education walas were trying to promote. The Brahmins and so on who went and these narrow class of people from above, they were accessing that education. It was very limited. At some point they decided that हमको अपनी बीवियों को भी पढ़ाना चाहिए. So we need to teach them. We also need to teach them, make them literate. And one of those complaints, I love that statement. वो एक बंदा है बेचारा बड़ा परेशान हो रहा है क्योंकि उसकी वो सोचता है कि मैं शेक्सपियर भी पढ़ता हूँ, मैं ये भी करता हूँ, but हमारी जिंदगी में वो औरतें कहाँ हैं? And they are looking for companionate marriage. मतलब मियाँ बीवी का जो रिश्ता होता है वो एक companionate relationship होना चाहिए. and that's being promoted as an ideal at that stage. अब कहाँ से मिलेंगे तुमको कंपेनियन? हमने तो अंग्रेजी एजुकेशन सीख ली, हम तो शेक्सपियर भी पढ़ रहे हैं, हम इसको भी पढ़ रहे हैं, उसको भी, हमारी बीवियाँ जो है वो तो पत्थर की तरह से वो फंसी हुई है कहीं पर. So it's so instrumental that they start teaching them. They start making them literate. मतलब वो भी मर्द डिसाइड करेंगे कि तुम चलो तुमको पढ़ा देते हैं ताकि तुम मेरे साथ बात कर सको. This is the attitude with which they are creating this dynamic. Okay. So anyway, they do that, and all this is well documented in my book. You read it, you find some of it is very serious, some of it is entertaining also. So from that point of view. So anyway, so this is in this context, in this larger mahal, to think of education in a completely different way. And you have to understand, I mean, the power of what Jyotiba Phule is trying to do. I mean, you know, why are these people together in one little unit? It's Jyotiba Phule, it's Savitribai Phule, it's Fatima Sheikh, it's Usman Sheikh. ये क्या है? ये एक छोटा सा नेटवर्क है, which is actually reimagining the world. It's reconstructing the way you think about your place in the world and what education will mean. Because education is not to say just, it's not 3 hours. कि आपने maths पढ़ लिया, tables सीख लिए, अंग्रेजी alphabet पढ़ लिया, बस अब तुम educated हो गए. The most revolutionary idea that Jyotiba Phule provides us with is that actually what is education about? It is about opening the third eye. It's called Tritiya Ratna. जो तीसरी आंख है. What is the तीसरी आंख? ये तो हमारी 2 आंखें हैं. उससे हम देखते हैं. सोचने, देखना एंड सोचना और एनालाइज करना कहाँ से आता है? वो दिमाग से आता है. It's coming from how you process what you see, how you process what you hear. Okay, so this is the Tritiya Ratna. Is you have to open that. It's the analytical eye. It is not the reading eye. It is the analytical eye. It's the capacity to think, to analyze, and to criticize, and to find your own answers. Once you've got the tools, you don't need anybody else. You know, you will be, your innate thinking capacity has already been stoked, and it comes. So that's where the power of education lies. It doesn't lie in learning mechanically, ABCD or whatever it is. It is in what it will tell you what you need to do in order to understand the world, to analyze the world, to be able to argue for yourself, to think for yourself, to be critical of whatever you see around you, not to accept blindly what is being told to you, which is the Pahara system, do dun char is one way, or even learning the text by heart is a method by which you can pass the examination, but the moment you're asked a serious question, you'll be stuck, you won't be able to analyze. So that is what Phule is trying to do, and he writes Gulamgiri, he writes stories about, and the form that he uses is also very interesting. He does povadas, he does sort of nataks, that are taken around and speak and so on. So he's using popular means by which he's propagating what he's thinking. Now it's in that context that he opens a school for girls. It is very interesting. Why is he opening the school for girls? Because the girls, like these castes, all women have been excluded from education. So education is to be then shared. It's not highly controlled sort of material. It is something that should be accessed by everybody, and education in the sense that he devised it. So we see that Phule is already coming into this with a certain idea. Why is it that he thinks of a girls' school? And why is it that he's creating a school for girls? Why aren't those first generation educated men among the Brahmins and the guys and so on, thinking of a school for girls. Their schooling is actually highly controlled. It would be, you know, they get a tutor, or the husbands will teach them and teach them only what they think that you should read. And that's, I mean, the great Mr. Nanade controlled his wife's reading to the extent that ये पढ़ना है ये नहीं पढ़ना है, हाँ तो सेंसर भी चल रहा है वहाँ पर. It's not as if saying I can read, so I can read anything. It needs to be controlled because good wives have to be produced at the end of it. And the good wives will only do if you read certain kinds. Now there were some good wives, including what's her name, Rasa Sundari Devi in Bengal, who was technically उसको पढ़ाया भी नहीं गया था because she was the wife of a zamindar. Zamindars didn't need education because man was not educated. They didn't think कि उसको भी पढ़ाने की ज़रूरत है. But she was desperate. वो भागवत पुराण, she was a Chaitanya follower. So she wanted to read the Bhagavad Puran in the original. She wanted to read it. Bengali में नहीं. But she could read. So अपने बच्चों की, look at the charm, the desire of women to be open up to the world. When her children were learning the alphabet, she learned the alphabet with them. And once you learn the alphabet, you can start to read. Then she deconstructs, you know, and she takes from it stuff that she herself is going to find ways of living her own life, you know. And she ends up with a completely different understanding of this education. She said, one of her statements, which is lovely, is to say, people say this is Kali Yuga. Okay? They're always saying it's Kali Yuga. This is Kali Yuga. Blessed Kali Yuga, which has got schools for girls. You know, so that's the power of the educated person who really can see the power of whatever. So I think the agenda of opening that school for girls in a time when you're highly controlling the alphabet and choosing to create subjects which are going to be pliant to the male agenda, it's the really revolutionary thing. And so in that exercise, now nobody wants women to be educated because some of them can see the power of what will it need? It will need to question. Nobody wants anyone to question. Lower orders and women certainly not. Perhaps even other men, they don't want it. You want to control education. You want to ensure that जो रट्टा लगाया उसी को पढ़ो. You don't want anything more than that because सोचने की capacity में से फिर तो questions हम पूछेंगे और पूछोगे तो फिर सारा, you know, the whole system begins to shake when you do that kind of thing. So anyway, there's something. The school is on. They suffer enormous discrimination from the people. They throw powder at them. I mean, the janta around them knows ये हो क्या रहा है यहाँ पर, and they are quite agitated about the fact that you are doing this thing, which is, they'll say it's unshastrik, but they can also see why it is dangerous. उससे फिर the whole system starts to मतलब उसमें बिगाड़ जाता है वो पूरा संस्था. So at the end of the day, why is the most striking piece of writing to me, the most powerful piece of writing that I have come across by anyone who has been to school in the 19th century, a girl, is Muktabai Salve's essay. Now, one of the nice things that the feminists did, and we've done some nice things, and maybe we have done some very nice things either, but be that as it may, it is interesting that we didn't actually know our own history as contributed by women. मतलब जो औरतों की भागीदारी थी लिखने में और बड़ा लंबा इतिहास है, because you can go back, आप मेरे बुद्धिस्ट टाइम्स में भी जा सकते हैं. वहाँ पर भी लोग जो थे बोल रहे थे और कंपोज कर रहे थे और क्रिटिकल एंगेजमेंट करते थे. छठी शताब्दी से ईसा पूर्व में there is this account of Bhikkhuni जो मतलब घर छोड़ करके she becomes a bhikkhuni, और then she's sitting under a tree and she's meditating, ध्यान कर रही है. अब मार जो है वो तो हमेशा मर्द है, एंड वो बड़ा मतलब ही इज़ वेरी ऑफेंडेड, तो वो आके उसको कहता है, उसको स्टोक करता है कि सर क्या कर रही है तू यहाँ बैठ करके पेड़ के नीचे, व्हाटएवर, तुझे तो 2 उंगली की ज्ञान चाहिए. अब 2 उंगली की ज्ञान क्या होती है कि आप अपना 2 उंगली डालो चावल के में, जो आप चावल पका रहे हो तो वो एक थोड़ा सा दाना निकाल करके देखो कि वो
पका है कि नहीं,
है ना. 2 उंगली, दैट इज व्हाट इज द two finger exercise. All you need is 2 fingers का knowledge. And she says to him, what will I do with 2 fingers knowledge? I seek akasha, the space. That is what she's looking for. She's looking for a way to understand the world. I want my own means of understanding the world. ये क्या चीज होती है? ये तो तुमने हमको चूल्हा चौके में फेंक दिया. This is not what we want to do. That's a sexual division of labor you have created. We don't want it. हमें नहीं चाहिए, you know. So look at it. मतलब 6वीं शताब्दी हिसाब से औरतें they are उनकी समझ है कि हो क्या रहा है हमारे साथ at the end of the day. And they call it, you know, सिलबट्टे की ज्ञान. You know, वो हर चीज को तुमको सिलबट्टे में पीसना पड़ता है, because even the grain and all has to be pieced down. So that's the metaphors they use are everyday metaphors from their रोजमर्रा की जिंदगी से, but the manner in which they express it. So they have aspirations for themselves. They have a critical relationship to the world. They don't want to be stuck with a no yarn kind of situation. So this is some of the stuff that we were able to unravel. So there's a book which is called Source. I think it's called, what's it called? It's edited by Susie Tharu and K. Lalita. It's a collection, 2-volume collection on sources of women's writing. Women's writing in India, it's called. Volume 1 and Volume 2. And you have this whole account throughout history how people have actually struggled, women have struggled to access knowledge. So it's a very interesting collection. So कई तरह की writings हैं, but by the time you come to the 20th century, you have novelists and so on. So it's very, right. This is one of the things that we had to do in order to say that, look, हमारी भी इतिहास है जिसमें we were not satisfied with the, and because हमको बार-बार ये कहा जाता था, feminism has come from the West. बकवास. I'll tell you what is there in 6th century BC. उन्होंने सोचा भी नहीं था उसके लिए, you know, and your Buddhist nuns are saying that, you know. So in some ways we have reduced the debate and the understanding to narrow छोटे-छोटे टुकड़े बना करके खिलाए जा रहे हैं, लोगों को गुट्टी पिलाई जा रही है, and इससे फिर, you know, people are satisfied with that. That scenario is now in the 20th century being reformulated by this understanding कि knowledge for itself. And Muktabai Salve, this 13-year-old girl, which is extraordinary, it would have been lost to history. That piece of writing was found in some paper in Ahmednagar, found in a library in Ahmednagar, and was produced and put into the sources of this women writing in India. Volume 2 में I think, और या उसमें उसको डाला गया था. So Muktabai Salve, she makes a full scale. She's only 13 years old, but she understands. मतलब उसको इसका तीसरा आँख खुल गया. She understands what is going on in the manner in which knowledge is being controlled and being passed on. So she actually does a critical analysis of Peshwai. Peshwai के ज़माने में क्या होता था? Peshwai's time was a very bad time. One of the chapters I wrote in this book is it was very bad from the point of view women. Brahmin women got the worst of the Peshwai because they had to conform in a certain kind of way, which because their sexuality had to be controlled, their lives had to be controlled so completely. So, you know, there's all that system of controls is in place. In that situation, Muktabai is free thinking and is able to understand her own location. She's a Mang Raki, so she's even lowest of the low she is. And she writes this essay, which is an incomplete essay because it's so full of anguish. She's talking about कि हमारी औरतें जब बच्चा पैदा करती हैं, they have to go out in the open. No doctor will come and look after them. You know, a whole critique that she makes of the way in which social relations is being articulated in the 19th century. So she does all of that. And having done that, she suddenly, you know, sort of, the essay is inconclusive because she said, I can't write anymore, मेरा दिमाग फट जाएगा. तो essay incomplete है. You can understand the anguish that she's been through. That girl is a product of the Savitribai Phule Fatima Sheikh, Chakravarti Phule, that network which is making knowledge and the capacity to analyze available to people who have been denied access to learning. So it's an extremely powerful thing that is being done at that point of time, and then it leads to an explosion. Once women access the education, they begin to write in very powerful ways. I mean, Ramabai wrote a very powerful account of the high caste Hindu woman, and she does that as a kind of mirror reflection of Manu ने 4 stages बना दिए थे लोगों के. She does precisely that in the context of girls. The little girl, then the married woman, then the widow, and then the mother. You know. So you turn Manu on his head, and you do this kind of thing. So she's very powerful in her analysis. She's asked. There's a point when there's Rakhmabai. Rakhmabai is also a very radical person. We should all. Sutra, she came from a Sutra family. Her father was well endowed. Construction business में उन्होंने Bombay बन रहा था, and they had grown to get some benefits out of that. So he left, when he died, he left money in the name of his daughter. Rakhmabai's mother, in that caste, widow remarriage is provisional. So she remarried. And at the age of, but the critical thing, and this is something that you must all know, even at this point of time, marriage is controlled entirely within the caste. So it's an endogamous group, you marry within the group, and that's it. So when it comes to her getting to an age, they have to look for a boy for her. So they get a boy, and they try and make him agree to the fact that he will come and live in the father-in-law's house, and he will also be educated along with Rakhmabai, who's continuing her education. He comes, but he changes he is not very interested in education, so he changes his whatever it is, and then he goes to court afterwards when she's about 17 or 18, and he says she must come and live in his house. And Rakhmabai says, no, I will not. She refuses to go. And she takes the position. This is highly, highly radical. Because she says, I was a child when this marriage happened. I was under 13. And so I was not a consenting party to this. Mera consent nahi tha isme. This is a very powerful idea. There's a court case. The lower court decides to ignore it, give her relief. They don't insist on it. But this boy goes to a high court. Now, he's partly interested in the fact that she's the owner of this house. So he wants her to come and live in his house so that he will get access to that property and so on. She stands her ground, and in the higher court also she refuses. And the judge tells her, you'll have to go, you'll be imprisoned. So she has to go to jail for violating the terms as it was understood. She said, I'd rather go to jail. Now there's a crisis because he's not interested in her going to jail. He's actually interested in the house. And that's not going to happen. So actually, at the end of the day, you see what the kinds of, complicated for women because if they go in one direction, they get closed off. If they go in another direction, also it gets closed off. So at the end of the day, she says, and then it's of no use. He doesn't want her to go to jail particularly. He wants her and that property and so on. So finally, he buys her free. She has to buy her freedom. She gives him they settle for money, and money is given, and she gets out. But there is a huge mobilization across Maharashtra. This is the same time that Phule is doing, roughly, so at the end of the day, you can see how radical the agenda of education could be, and how radical the dynamics of caste and gender is in the context of colonial India. So at the end of the day, she made her peace with in the sense having bought her freedom. She goes off to England and she trains to be a doctor. She comes back, she never marries again. She never marries. And she ends up finally becoming the chief surgeon in the Surat Medical Hospital. So you can see she led a full career. So Rakhmabai was actually quite, she stood her ground. Ramabai, when she was writing, and when there was this debate going on, she writes a very powerful line, which again I think is like, it's the Tisri Aankh Khuli Hui hai. She says, why did the British government let her have her freedom? Their compact is with the male population in India. They are not actually interested in women. Sati and all this. They are not interested in women. They are interested in the compact that they made with the male population. So, the analysis that they bring to the fore, in the way in which they are describing what's happening around them, I think is very powerful. So, that's the meaning of education. It's to be able to analyze. It's to be able to understand society, to understand knowledge is there is an instrumental reason for knowledge also. It's not just we learn the Shastras and we go on to Rattamaru finding. It has to have a purpose. It has to be something that informs you, changes you, transforms you. And if the times are moving in a certain direction, there is a reason. And for the lower orders, the capacity to think and argue is very critical. It's very important. It's like, Ambedkar, a few 50 years or 50, 60 years down the line, he goes to Columbia, he studies in sociology. He writes one of the most powerful books. One of his best books is The Annihilation of Caste, in which he's talking about the end of man. What the sociologists are not doing, he does excellently, which is the relationship between marriage and the reproduction of caste. Stuff that I wrote so many years later, but that's one reason. So at the end of the day, why should we access education if not to be able to think for ourselves? And that's important, I think, as far as I'm concerned. And that's the heritage that Savitribai Phule Fatima Sheikh, their struggles. And Savitri is extraordinary because she brings home a Brahmin widow who has her child, and then that child is adopted by the Phule family. So they don't have their own biological child. And it's interesting that she's actually, that decision is taken by them because Phule was asked to remarry. In the usual way, it's probably a wife's fault. But we know very well that not being able to reproduce is not necessarily something to do with women. So it's very interesting that he stood his ground. He stood by his politics. He worked with the idea of the Tritiya Ratna. He wrote enormously. So many of those Pavadas and so on which are very powerful. That mode of thinking was made available to women. through the school, the girls' school that they create in Pune. So that's one of the, I think that's the really revolutionary dimension of the experience of that time and the history of that time against we have reduced it to saying written word, mathematics and written word, but I think there's so much more to education, so much more to the thinking person, which is actually critical. And if you're not going to do that, then you're equivalent to just reproducing somebody else's now. So that's what we have to think of. I'll stop at that. We can have a discussion.